So today I'm going to talk about train journey, and this will be a bit of a discussion and an explanation of the poem. It's not comprehensive, but it should give you an overview of some of the issues that the poem deals with and some of the language features that are within the poem. First of all, Train Journey is a poem, again, about the relationship with the landscape. It describes in detail some of the real landscape features, trees, moon, the rock, and so on. And it's really about the observer being a participant in the landscape and responding to the landscape in different ways. The poem's an acknowledgement of the harshness of the Australian landscape, and it deals with themes like life versus death, parenthood or the role of mother, and the landscape obviously, and the country that we live in. So I thought that I would read through the poem first of all before we just get into the discussion. So it's called Train Journey. Glassed with cold sleep and dazzled by the moon, out of the confused hammering dark of the train, I looked and saw under the moon's cold sheet your delicate dry breasts, country that built my heart. And the small trees on their uncoloured slope like poetry moved, articulate and sharp and purposeful, under the great dry flight of air, under the crosswise currents of wind and star. Clench down your strength, box tree and iron bark. Break with your violent root the virgin rock. Draw from the flying dark its breath of dew, till the unliving come to life in you. Be over the blind rock a skin of sense, under the barren height a slender dance. I woke and saw the dark small trees that burn, suddenly into flowers more lovely than the white moon. So there's lots of stuff happening in this poem. First of all, if you look at the structure of the poem, it looks very similar to a Shakespearean or an English sonnet because it has 3 quatrains followed by 2 couplets. Normally there'd only be 1 couplet, but she's got 2 couplets there. She's also got a little bit of a loose rhyme. She doesn't follow the rhyming pattern of a sonnet strictly, but there's a little bit of a loose rhyme or a reflective kind of a rhyme happening at the end of each line. There is a sense of rhythm as well, an almost hammering rhythm, especially towards the start of the poem, which is reflective of the train, a train-like rhythm, if you will. So let's go through stanza by stanza and see what we notice as we interact with the poem. So the first stanza, it seems that the persona has been interrupted during their train journey and sort of is in a state of semi-awake. And so we have this sense of a dreamlike kind of lack of awareness of her surroundings, but she's an observer because she's travelling through the landscape. We know this because of the words, she's glassed through cold sleep and dazzled by the moon. We also need to notice here that she's got some really nice light imagery which continues through the poem with the symbol of the moon and that recurring image of that moon. The moon is able to illuminate certain things that she can then see. She says, I looked and saw under the moon's cold sheet. And that idea of a sheet is almost like a protective covering. Then the idea of perhaps a mother figure, the earth being a mother figure, has come through with the words, your delicate dry breasts, which is a nice use of alliteration, and reminds us of the harshness of the Australian landscape and how we often have to struggle with drought. Why would the mother's breasts be dry? Have a think about that. That allusion to motherhood, perhaps the connotation of infertility, or something that can't be sustained, a landscape that can't be looked after. Just backing up to the light imagery again, and that really nice use of the word dazzled by the moon. I like that sort of glittery kind of vocab there. It's also giving us a sense that it's a dreamscape almost, because she's not really seeing things clearly. It's almost as though it's a twilight situation, and she only sees certain things that are illuminated. Towards the end of that stanza, she has the words, country that built my heart, which gives us an indication of her relationship with the country or the landscape. So she feels very, very close. To use that idea of heart, it also is reminiscent of Dorothea Mackellar's 1904 poem, My Country, in which she repeats the phrase, core of my heart, my country. And in that poem, Dorothea McKellar also uses the personification of the country or the land as female. Moving on to the second stanza, Judith Wright starts to identify some of the things that she can actually see because of the moon's illumination. So she talks about the small trees and uses a nice simile and some alliteration to show that she can almost hear the trees speaking. It says, the small trees on their uncoloured slope, like poetry moved, articulate and sharp. So this is almost almost personification of these small trees and how she really notices them and their purposefulness, if that's a word. I like the effect of the simile because it's almost as though the trees are giving life, or that they can speak, or that they communicate, and that there is a definite relationship that the persona has with the landscape if they are if there's the illusion of the trees communicating with her. That light imagery is alluded to again with the word star at the end of the stanza, and the crosswind currents and the dry flight of air, some really nice assonance and alliteration in there, which gives us the feeling of being out in nature and being subjected to the elements of nature. In stanza 3, we're presented with 3 in a row of very imperative verbs where she is almost creating an invocation. These 2 trees, the box tree and the ironbark, which I'll talk about in a moment. But this imperative tone is created with the verbs that she chooses. She says, clench down your strength, break with your violent root, and draw from the flying dark. And that flows over too into the next stanza where she starts with the verb be. All very imperative kind of instructions or invocations to nature. So we'll talk a little bit about the 2 trees that she's mentioned here, the box tree and the ironbark. The ironbark, if you haven't seen it, is a very strong, sturdy tree. It's a eucalypt tree. It has really rough bark. The bark itself is resistant to fire and heat, and it produces some really beautiful hardwood that is regarded as very top quality. It's strong, it's durable, it's used in housing frames and sporting equipment and flooring. There are different varieties of the ironbark. If you haven't seen them, there's red and grey and different ones. You can lean against this tree, you can feel its bark and know that it's strong and sturdy. The box tree similarly has very coarse, thick bark. It's also a eucalyptus tree, and it's a medium to tall tree. So she's picked 2 trees that are kind of imposing and tall and strong, and then she talks about what she wants them to do. Some people suggest that this is a bit of a phallic image, and that when she says break with your violent root the virgin rock, it's a sexual image. Whether you agree with that or not, there's still a very aggressive kind of tone in this particular stanza. Even though it's aggressive though, there's a little bit of hopefulness within that there could be some positive future for the landscape, because before there were the images of dry breasts and delicateness and the connotation of infertility and drought, dryness, wind. And now it's kind of like there's this hope that dew could come, that breath and life could come within the landscape. We've got that theme, if you look closely, of life and life versus death, which I mentioned at the start, and some personification as well in that stanza. It's almost as though the persona in the poem is imploring the landscape to take charge and to survive. You must survive, she's almost saying to the landscape. Do whatever you can to survive. And there's the contrast as well between drought, dew, unliving and life, fertility and infertility. Then the poem ends with 2 couplets. So she's got, be over the blind rock a skin of sense with some really nice sibilance, under the barren height a slender dance, and then that ellipsis there, that punctuation, which is indicating she's continuing on. Couplets usually in a sonnet provide a conclusive quality, so I've asked you in the questions to have a look at each of the stanzas and summarise them in your own words. Figure out what do you think is the problem or the issue or the point that is made in each different stanza, and then do you think, and then how, the 2 couplets create some kind of a conclusion or resolution or even just a change from the other three stanzas. The final couplet, very interestingly, goes into a different sort of state of being almost, because she says, I woke. So this is where she suddenly is not just like an observer, but she's kind of like in amongst it. She's fully conscious. It's almost as though before all of those other stanzas were just kind of a dreamscape, a lack of awareness, just sort of semi-observing what was happening around her. And then suddenly she says, I awoke. It's almost as though she has now got new insight into what she can see. And she refers to the dark small trees and describes how they burn suddenly into flowers more lovely than the white moon. We've got the moon and the light imagery recurring here. We've got some figurative language. We've got the allusion to some more energy and beauty. And earlier it seemed like it was more of a subconscious experience, more of maybe a heart response, whereas this is a very conscious, very insightful, and looking at the landscape with fresh eyes. It's almost as though she has realised that nature can sustain and survive in this barren landscape, as opposed to before, her reflections before. It seems that in this poem, Judith Wright seeks to reconcile the opposing forces that she can observe in the landscape through which she's travelling on this train journey. There's that imagery or allusion to motherhood, to the land being the mother, and that the motherland can't feed her child, which the persona is like. There's a definite recognition of Australia's harsh and unyielding landscape. Some people suggest that the train journey, the title, is a reference to colonial expansion, which is possible. And if that's the case, then what are your thoughts on that relationship between the landscape and the persona and the physical landscape that she's describing, and then her heart and subconscious and conscious response to that? I'd love to hear what you think about all of these things in the comments in Google Classroom.